In my last video, I talked about my experiences in trying to start a business here in Canada, and a lot of you left very interesting comments, many of which would make for great future discussion topics. Clearly, things in my life didn't quite work out the way that I wanted them to. But one of the things that I find very interesting about the comment section is that many people seem to have totally opposite views about how to solve many of the problems that I talked about. In my opinion, this lack of consensus on seemingly simple issues explains a lot about why our society is currently so dysfunctional and unproductive. To start off with, here's a comment that was in the minority, but I did see a number of people agreeing with this sentiment. This guy admits he would rather be a leech on his landlord. Grow up and get a 40-hour job. This has to be mental illness. Now for comments like this, I've got a different idea that not even a single person in the comment section is mentioned. And that is, if my landlord, Michael Klein, wants to make a bit more money, why doesn't he get a job? I have a lease agreement, which is a legal contract that specifies the cost of my rent. I have never missed a rent payment in my entire life, and I am in total compliance with the terms of my rental contract. The new landlord wants to squeeze more money out of everyone here, but currently, that's not legally allowed under existing rent control laws. It's right there in Section 6.1, 110, and 120 of the Residential Tenancies Act of Ontario. And so, this is why he's trying to rent-evict everyone, in order to evade the rent control obligations. Now, I also see a few people posting comments like this one. This is what happens with big nanny state government, with the communist idea of rent control. And you might be surprised to learn that I actually kind of agree with these comments. There are many historical examples where governments try to impose price controls, but just end up causing market distortions in the long run. So, why do I support my rent control, even if it might be financially disadvantageous to my landlord? Well, those are the terms of my contract, under existing tenancy law, and I'm of the opinion that if we're going to try and pretend that we live in a society that follows the rule of law, then we should at least make an attempt to follow the existing laws that are currently in the books and written in the contracts. If I had instead posted a video with some sob story about how I lost all of my money day trading stock options contracts, and as a result was getting evicted for failing to pay the agreed upon rent in my rental contract, I would be rightfully criticized for my irresponsible and speculative investment decisions. By the same token, when the new landlord bought this building 1 year ago, and then finds out how he now has to honor all of these low profit margin rental contracts that he just took over, he's just learning some life lessons about how to be a successful businessman. Maybe he should have done a little bit more research about how rental contracts work in Ontario before buying this place. Just like how I should do my own research before investing my life savings into out-of-the-money Tesla call options. If the iron fist of capitalism applies to me, it also applies to my landlord. And if he didn't fully understand the financial terms of the contracts that he was taking over, then maybe he's not a very good capitalist. Maybe he should admit defeat and just get a job. As a business owner myself, I'm a huge fan of capitalism. And when I lie awake in bed at night, I think about questions like this. When a capitalist makes a bad financial decision, who should bear the cost of the externalities associated with making that decision? Is it the capitalist himself, or is it a building full of elderly people and cancer patients who are otherwise in total compliance and good standing with their lease agreements? Clearly, in the court of public opinion, we don't have a consensus on the answer to this question in the Canadian province of Ontario. It also begs another question. If the tenants can share the unexpected losses, should we also expect the landlord to share the unexpected profits with the tenants of the building as well? One of the fundamental problems here is that the government is trying to play both sides. They want to pretend like rent control still exists on older buildings, so that tenants will shut up about it and stop talking about it. But they also want to give landlords a way to escape from it, because it's financially difficult to maintain in the long term. Rent controls have already been removed from any newly constructed buildings here in Ontario, but my building is an older one that's supposed to be still protected. The fact that we don't all agree about what the right answer is here creates a lot of trust issues in society, and I'd argue this lack of consensus on seemingly simple issues is becoming a more general problem that substantially contributes to our poor labor force productivity. If we don't know what laws are going to be enforced and how they will be enforced, how can we plan for the future? From my perspective as a tenant, the current situation is worse than not having rent control at all, because it leaves people with a false sense of security and completely upends your life when you get a surprise eviction notice in the middle of a historic housing crisis. On the issue of rent control being financially unsustainable, I personally think that one potential solution would be to modify the rent control on these older legacy buildings in such a way that continues to protect vulnerable people, but also allows for some kind of graceful release valve that can return rents to market rates in the long term. Maybe something like a staggered increase that takes place slowly over a 3 to 5 year period, instead of the 3 months that a renoviction gives you. The process could also involve input from the tenant and award slower increases if the tenant qualifies, based on age, medical necessity, income, and other relevant criteria that the government wants to promote, such as being a small business owner or contributing to society in other ways. From the landlord's perspective, this mitigates the balance sheet liability of a rent-controlled tenant from a potentially unknown infinite value toward a small finite number that can be calculated. I also think that the N13 process could be improved to emphasize that the renovations are actually necessary, and not just that they require vacant possession. Now, so far, I've given you the tenant's perspective, but since this video is about productivity, there's a lot to say about how our economy is unproductive for landlords as well. I'd argue that renovictions are also very stressful and costly for landlords as well. Technically, they're not legal, so you have to pull all sorts of shady tricks to make sure that you get away with it. You have to go through all of the motions to pretend that you want to do good faith renovations. This includes things like filing building permits, renewing building permits, and figuring out how to appease the municipality. You'll also receive lots of negative media attention about your renovictions, and have to deal with all these stupid YouTubers who make videos explaining what you're doing. Tenants usually aren't very happy about being arbitrarily evicted, and this can generate a wide variety of stressful reactions from them. And remember, during a renoviction, the landlord doesn't actually want to renovate the apartment. The entire purpose of a renoviction is to get the tenant to leave under the guise of a good faith N13 renovation, so that rent control no longer applies, and the apartment can be immediately re-rented at market rates. From this perspective, every dollar that you invest into the actual renovation of the apartment is a dollar that's being wasted. If you think about this for a moment, you'll realize that this creates one of the most unproductive housing incentives possible. To create evidence of an actual renovation, you'll have to do at least some of the renovation work. But since you don't actually want to do any of this renovation work, you'll use the cheapest possible materials, the cheapest possible labor, and do as little of the actual renovation work as possible. The apartment that I live in here is fairly old, but everything in this apartment still functions. One of the things that they claim to want to renovate are these kitchen cabinets. In the middle of a historic housing crisis, do you think that it's the sign of an efficient and productive economy to take these kitchen cabinets, pay money to have someone tear them down, turn them into industrial waste, and then pay someone to take them to a landfill? And not only that, but buy a new set of cheap cabinets that look basically the same and pay to have them installed? I also think it's worth backing up a bit and giving even more consideration to just how terrible our housing situation is here in Ontario for honest small-time landlords. Regardless of how you feel about landlords, this is a video that I'd strongly encourage you to watch. I'll put a link to it in the description. This video describes several heartbreaking stories from small-time landlords who were terrorized by violent, destructive, and antisocial tenants who didn't pay rent for as much as 16 months before getting evicted. In one story, the woman describes how she struggled to hold onto her house throughout the period of being a single mom, but is now on the verge of losing it because of one nightmare tenant who doesn't pay rent, but on the authority of the tenant board is allowed to stay there under an order to not be violent. In another case, the tenant stopped paying rent and set fire to a man's house, which did result in an arrest for arson being made. However, even after the arrest, the landlord still wasn't able to get an eviction order for almost 6 months. After the fire, the tenant started sending taunting emails to the landlord and accumulated $26,000 in unpaid rent. It's hard enough to get ahead in this country, and if by some miracle you manage to get a single piece of property that you can rent out to someone, everything that you've worked for in your life can be destroyed by a single bad tenant. From my perspective, the worst part of all this is that landlords here in Ontario are starting to develop so much contempt for tenants that when I talk about my renoviction situation, some people will just tune out completely and lump me in with these antisocial nightmare tenants. The video further explains how many of these small-time landlords are now choosing to not rent out their properties at all, which only further exacerbates our completely insane housing crisis. Because of how bad things are, many small-time landlords are choosing to get out of the business entirely, leading to a further concentration of housing in the hands of large corporate landlords who seem to have an extreme contempt for humanity. Now, I hate to be talking so much about housing on a channel that's supposed to be focused on technology, but if we want to get serious about living in a technological utopia of the future, where we can all spend our free time writing new and exciting JavaScript frameworks, we have to get serious about fixing this housing crisis. You can't write a computer program if you don't have a computer, and you can't have a life if you don't have a place to live. So as far as I'm concerned, the housing affordability problem is now bad enough that we should start considering it a software development problem. I'm currently 37, and we've been in a so-called housing crisis for as long as I can remember, going back to my early university days. Throughout my co-ops and school experience, I had to move to find a new place to live again on the order of about 15 times. So at this point, I've spent a significant amount of effort in my life trying to find housing. It's been nice to settle down here and live in the same place for the last 7 years. But once again, I'm close to being a vagrant again, just like in my university days. The CMHC says that housing affordability could be restored by the early 2030s. That sounds very exciting to me, and I await those days with great anticipation. By that time, I'll be 42 years old. Now, continuing on the theme of productivity, the other type of comment that I received was a more general type of just get a job comment. And my response to these types of comments are, where do you think that jobs come from? If everyone in the world said to themselves, just get a job, where would they work at? Would we all just work for the government, that incredibly productive and well-run organization that everyone loves? A lot of these comments seem to have a very defeatist attitude. Most people did seem to agree with my frustrations about the corporate world, but many people more or less said that I should just suck it up and deal with it, because that's the way the world is. If everyone thought this way, new businesses would never be created, and we'd all be stuck working for the worst company imaginable. Starting a business is not for everyone, and I think if someone's immediate response to watching my 37-year-old broke loser video is to say, just get a job, then I think that getting a job really is the right path for that person. However, if you watch the full video and you're still willing to give business a try, then you might be the right type of person to run one. But you have to accept the fact that you might find yourself making the same video when you turn 37, and if you scroll down far enough in that video, you'll note that not all of the comments are supportive. Another reasonable suggestion that many people made was that I should have worked full-time for a while after graduation. With the benefit of hindsight, this plan does seem quite a bit more reasonable to me now. Although at my age, and for a number of other mundane reasons, I think the opportunity cost of trying to do that would be a bit too high for me at this point, and it still makes more sense to just continue what I'm doing. Now, as a side note, I should point out that from a legal and tax perspective, I already do have a job. I receive a T4 slip from my business every year, and pay into the same Canadian pension plan that everyone else does. A few other quick clarifications that I should make from the last video are, I mentioned that my average YouTube revenue for the last 6 months was about $700 a month. However, in some of my past business analytics videos, the ones that nobody watches, I have mentioned that the maximum monthly YouTube revenue was as much as $3,400 when my How to Make a CPU video was trending. And within the last 6 months, I also still had been doing some work for a client. But that work is currently on pause, and it's not clear if it's going to start back up again. Many people said that YouTube should only be a side thing, and in reality, it always sort of has been, up until now. It might be more accurate to say that I use it to fill in the gaps, and immediately switch back to the higher paying client work whenever it's available. But as I mentioned, that's recently dried up to nothing, and it no longer seems worth pursuing anyway. The next thing that I want to talk about is an interesting psychological blind spot that I've observed from reading the comments. In particular, some of the comments were very supportive and took my side on many of the issues that I faced. But at the same time, there are also a number of comments that seem to view me as the problem in these narratives. Clearly, there's at least one group of people that are on Team Robert, but another, admittedly smaller group, who watched the same video and are on the opposite team. But the one thing that I don't see emphasized enough in the comment section is how unproductive these experiences were, not just for me, but also for everyone else involved. When I said that a lot of startup founders are really just trying to scam investors or the government, I should have talked more about how they're accomplishing just that. They're trying to get away with a scam, but many of them are not even good at it. And the actual result is that they just end up lighting a pile of money on fire and produce absolutely nothing of value for themselves or society in general. For the IoT company that stuck me for $18,000, as far as I know, unless there is something much deeper going on, they completely imploded, and I was told that the investors pursued legal action against the founders. All of the code that we wrote, the hardware that was designed and built, The data that was gathered, the installations that were performed, the clients. As far as I know, all of it was completely discarded. Now, to be fair, in the story about the consultant who was sending all of these invoices for so-called unit tests, he probably did come out a little bit ahead as a result of his unethical behavior. But for the amount of effort that he put into trying to cover his tracks, like setting up a shell company, and learning how to use the unit test stub generator that he used, having his friend visit the office and pretend to be his CEO, and sending a few other pieces of nonsense documentation disguised as useful work, it really did seem like he was intelligent and motivated enough that he probably could have just done actual useful work for the company instead. But instead, he charged them thousands of dollars and actually had negative productivity. When I talked about the typical pump and dump model of a startup, I described it as not ethical or economically sustainable as a justification as to why I didn't pursue that route. In the comment section, almost all of the comments seemed to focus exclusively on the first part of that statement. Some of the comments seemed to paint me as the ethically pure protagonist of the story, and others seemed to view me as a sort of naive idealist who deserves to be taken advantage of for his lack of awareness and understanding of the real world. But I don't think I saw a single comment focusing on the part about economic sustainability in my statement. In discussing my experiences, I have provided a bit of my own interpretation, but I've tried to provide as many facts as possible so that the viewer can come to their own interpretation. The blind spot that I think people have here is to interpret a lot of my anecdotes as though they're a zero-sum narrative, with a clear hero and a clear villain, and the story arc is one where the winner, be it the hero or the villain, takes something of value from the other party and provides as little as possible in return. The lessons that most people seem to be taking away from my anecdotes are that you either need to be more ethical and stick to your principles as a protest against the forces of evil, or that you need to be less ethical and focus on your own selfish gain, because that's what everyone else is doing anyway, and you're just a sheep otherwise. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that being ethical is good and important, but I also understand that sometimes you may have to hurt people's feelings a bit, or bend the rules a little bit to actually get things done. If you think that I'm a good person, that's really awesome, but don't put me on too high of a pedestal. I promise that I'll eventually disappoint you, just like every other YouTuber. I promised in my last video that I would start being less professional and obedient, and some of the community posts that I've been making lately are a bit edgier than usual. So hopefully, you can find something there that will offend you. I'm of the opinion that you can be forgiven for being a bit selfish sometimes, as long as you can also manage to do something productive for society now and then. A slightly unethical society that has something productive going for it can still be prosperous, whereas a strictly ethical but extremely unproductive society won't. Currently, we seem to be living in the worst of both worlds, an extremely unethical and extremely unproductive society. For those of you who listened to my stories and came to the conclusion that you just need to be selfish and unethical because that's what everyone else is going to do, I don't think that's going to work out well for you. And conversely, if you try to live your life like a naive and trusting protagonist from a children's storybook, that probably won't have the outcome that you want either, because many people today are playing a totally different game. If we don't collectively manage to figure this out, we're just going to end up as a society of scammers, constantly trying to steal breadcrumbs from each other. You could argue that this is already starting to happen, when you take note of how many young people look up to influencers who are running all kinds of cryptocurrency scams and selling get-rich-quick courses. If we want to create a functioning economy, we have to first focus on doing things that are actually productive. And once we've created something of value, then you can go ahead and try to figure out how to steal it. When I started this channel, I wanted to keep it exclusively focused on technical topics and share the economically productive knowledge that I gained from my career in software engineering. But here I am, talking about things like rent control, the rule of law, and influencer scams. So next time that you hear a confused economist asking the question, "Why is labor force productivity so low?" send them this video explaining why.